A song once lived where words would bloom, now echoes haunt an empty room. The marker listens still and alone, afraid the music never known. What if your greatest enemy isn't failure, but the vision of yourself that could no longer create? There is a terrifying psychological phenomenon that artists, musicians, writers, and even game developers experience, though few speak of it openly. They begin to believe they have lost the very thing that made them who they are. Not through accident, not through age, but through the slow, cumulative weight of expectation. The expectation to produce, the expectation to improve, the expectation to matter, and somewhere between first creation and a tenth, something shifts. The joy becomes obligation, the gift becomes burden, the self becomes inseparable from work until the work, when falters, feels like dying. This is the landscape of Project Songbird. Not a game about monsters through monsters are present, not a game about survival through survival is demanded. It is a game about horror of looking inside yourself and finding the room empty, of pressing your ear to the wall of your own mind and hearing nothing but feedback. And today we are going to ask whether the horror is enough to make this game a legend or a merely beautiful idea that never fully learned to sing. Welcome to Jester's Hollow. Every creative person at some point fantasizes about the cabin. The cabin in the woods, the studio in the desert, the room at the top of the stairs where the world cannot reach you. It is the ultimate romantic image of artistic production, isolation versus virtue, distance as clarity, silence as the raw material from which masterpieces are forged. But why do we believe this? Why does the myth of the suffering artist persist with such tenacity? In Project Songbird, Dakota retreats to a cabin not because it's practical, but because it is necessary. The outside world has become unbearable, not through malice, but through noise. Expectation has accumulated like sediment, burying the original impulse beneath the layers of what others need her to be. The cabin is not an escape from creation, it is an escape from the audience. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the confrontation with one's own unconsciousness, the process of descending into the parts of the psyche we have neglected, repressed, or simply forgotten. The cabin, in this regard, is not a refuge. It is a threshold. By removing the external stimuli, Dakota does not find peace. She finds the parts of herself that the noise was keeping at bay. Jung called it the process of individualization, the integration of conscious and unconscious mind. But integration is not gentle, it requires facing what Jung termed as shadow, the repository of everything that we have denied in ourselves. The cabin, with its silence and its isolation, becomes the architectural manifestation of that condition. There are no distractions, there is only the self and the self accumulated darkness. The game understands something very crucial. Isolation does not heal creative wounds, it manifests them. Without external feedback, the artist's internal critique grows louder, more absolute, more cruel. The cabin becomes not a sanctuary but an echo chamber of self doubt. The myth that creativity requires suffering is exactly that, a myth, but a myth with teeth. It has destroyed careers, relationships, lives, and in Project Songbird, it is the very soil from which the horror grows. There is a particular terror that attends creative burnout, It is not the terror of exhaustion, though exhaustion is a part of it. It is the terror of absence, of sitting before an instrument, the canvas, and a blank document and feeling nothing. Not resistance, not frustration, just nothing. Psychologically, this state is devastating because it attacks identity. When your sense of self is built upon what you create, the inability to create is merely not a professional failure, it is an ontological collapse. You do not have a bad day, you cease to understand who you are. What happens when your identity becomes your work? This is a question Project Songbird asks with unflinching patience. Dakota is not a protagonist with a job. She is a protagonist who is her job, or was, until the job abandoned her. The horror is not that she cannot write music. The horror is that without music, she does not know if she exists. The cognitive dissonance occurs when our beliefs about ourselves conflicts with our experience. For Dakota, the belief, I am a musician, conflicts with her experience, I cannot make music. The mind, unable to resolve the contradiction, begins to fracture. This is self-alienation, the experience of becoming stranger to yourself, not depressed exactly, not anxious exactly, unfamiliar. The game does not announce this. It does not provide explanation or cutscenes explaining Dakota's psychology. It simply places you in the cabin and lets the environment speak. The crotched-out sheets of music, the piano that hasn't been tuned, the window that looks out on nothing but trees that seem to be waiting. The horror is that you understand immediately because most of us have stood at that threshold, even if we have not crossed it. There is a psychological phenomenon known as voice confrontation. When we hear our own recorded voice, most of us experience discomfort, even revulsion. The voice in our head, the one that we lived with our entire lives, sounds different when externalized, deeper, thinner, even alien. This occurs because we hear our own voices through bone conduction, vibration traveling through the skull to the inner ear, while recording capture only air conducted sounds. The result is a voice that is simultaneously ours and not ours, the sonic doppelganger. Project Songbird weaponizes this intimately. Sound is not merely an atmosphere in this game, it is a character. Every crack, every distant memory, every distorted noise is a fragment of Dakota's auditory identity. The soundscape of mind that is losing its grip on who it is. Musicians, perhaps more than any other artist, experience a unique form of self criticism. They do not merely see their work, they hear it. And hearing is more invasive than seeing. Sound enters the body, it vibrates in the chest, it occupies a space in a way that images do not. To be critical of one's own music is to be critical of one's own physical presence in the world. The game understands that auditory identity is fragile. We construct our sense of self partially through the sounds we produce, the music we make, and the voices we recognize as our own. When the soundscape becomes hostile, when piano plays notes you didn't press, when your recorded voice speaks words that you didn't say, the self becomes permeable, invisible. Dakota's deteriorating mental world is not shown through dialogues or diary entries. It is shown through acoustic decay. The music she creates becomes less coherent. The environment responds to her emotional state with sounds that have no clear source. The boundary between what she hears and what she imagines dissolve. This is not a supernatural horror. This is the horror of a mind that can no longer trust its own perceptions. The red door, the game's most loaded image, It appears without explanation. It demands to be opened, and when Dakota opens it, she does not enter a room, she enters another mode of being. Psychologically, the red door functions as the threshold between conscious and unconscious mind. Not a physical boundary, but a perpetual one. On one side, the cabin, the piano, and the attempt to create. On the other side, the dream logic, landscape, where repressed fears take architectural form. In Jungian terms, this is the descent into the shadows, the part of psyche that contains everything the conscious mind has rejected. But the game is not interested in Jungian terminology, it is interested in experience of the crossing, the hesitation before the handle, the knowledge, bone deep, that waits on the other side is not an enemy, but a truth. Compare this to dream logic rather than supernatural horror. In dreams, doors lead to where they need to lead. Colors have emotional rather than physical properties. Spaces rearrange themselves according to the psychological necessity. The red door does not need a ghost behind it, it only needs to represent the moment when Dakota stopped persisting. She can heal herself through isolation. Threshold in mythology and psychology are dangerous perceptions because they are irreversible. Once you know what waits in the basement, you cannot unknow it. The red door, once open, changes the cabin forever. Not because the cabin changes, but because Dakota's perception of it changes. The same room becomes different room when you understand what it contains. The red is significant. Red is the color of warning, yes, but also vitality, of blood, of life force itself. The door is not warning Dakota away, it is inviting her to become whole. An invitation is, on its own way, more terrifying than a threat. It would be easy to describe the monsters of Project Songbird in purely visual terms, to catalog their appearance, their behavior, their mechanical functions, but what they miss is the point entirely. What does each monster represent? That is the question the game wants us to ask. Not how do I defeat it, but what part of Dakota am I looking at? The entity in the game are not obstacles, they are emotions made flesh. Psychological horror often operates through this transition. The internal becomes external, the abstract becomes physical, the emotions becomes grosser. Silent Hill 2 did this with the guilt. Project Songbird does it with creative dread. The imposter phenomenon, commonly called the imposter syndrome, is the persistent belief that one's own success is undeserved, that competence is performance, that exposure as a fraud is imminent. In Dakota's case, the monsters that whisper are not supernatural entities, they are the externalized voices that has been living inside her for years, waiting for silence to be loud enough to be heard. The most disgusting monster is not the most grotesque. It is the one that most resembles Dakota herself. The figure at the piano, playing melodies that Dakota recognizes as her own but cannot remember writing. The self that continued creating after the conscious has given up. The artist that exists independently of the person. This is self-alienation at its most literal. The monster is not an enemy, it is a part of Dakota that she has abandoned and that has grown hungry in her absence. We must be honest. A psychological analysis, however thorough, cannot substitute for question that every horror game must ultimately answer. Is it scary? The atmosphere is the game's undeniable strength. The cabin breathes, the wood pressed in, the silence is not empty but charged, full of potential energy. The sense that something is listening. The horror as attenuation, not escalation. The game does not build to be a climax, it sustains a mood. The sound design deserves a particular praise. In a game about musicians, sound cannot be incidental, and it isn't. Every auditory element serves a narrative. The distortion of familiar melodies, the way silence becomes aggressive after prolonged exposure to ambient noise, the use of binaural audio to create the sense that something is standing directly behind the player. That this is not sound design supporting horror. This is sound design as the horror. The pacing is deliberate to a point of risk. The game trusts its audience to sit with discomfort. This will alienate players who expect rhythm, progress, and catharsis. But for those willing to inhabit the game's temporal logic, the slowness becomes a part of the terror. Time moves differently in isolation. The game replicates this. The puzzles are functional but rarely inspired. They serve a narrative without elevating it. The combat, or rather avoidance mechanics, are intentionally limited, which some players will interpret as lack of polish rather than aesthetic choice. And the game's commitment to ambiguity, while thematically appropriate, occasionally crosses into opacity. There are moments where symbolism becomes too dense that meaning threatens to collapse into more aesthetic. But these are criticisms of execution. The game knows what it wants to be. It does not always succeed perfectly, but it succeeds often enough that it feels like blemishes on something genuinely attemptive rather than flawed in something cynical. So, the question the video promised to answer: is Project Songbird a legend or merely a beautiful idea that never fully learned to sing? The answer depends on which lens you apply. As a horror game, it is strong but narrow. It does not offer the variety of experience that define the genre's masterpieces. There are no set piece scares, no escalating threat, no cathartic release. The horror is static, suffocating, psychological. This is not a flaw but limitations. Player who come seeking roller coaster will find a meditation instead. But as a psychological narrative, it is exceptional. It understands something that few games about creativity understand, that terror is not in the act of failing, but in the possibility that you were never truly capable to begin with. That your past success were accidents, that the well has not run dry from overuse, but because there was never water in it at all. Its themes are without question stronger than its gameplay. This is the game that should be experienced once slowly in dark room with headphones. It is not a game to be replayed, optimized, or mastered. It is a game to be witnessed. Is it a legend? Not quite. Legend requires influence, longevity, cultural penetration. Project Songbird is too intimate for that, too specific. It speaks to a particular experience, creative burnout, identity crisis, and the terror of silence. And speaks it to with such precision that it may not resonate universally. But is it a letdown? Absolutely not. It is a beautiful, wounded, honest thing, a game that takes risk with tone and pacing that large production would never attempt. A game that understands horror not as a genre of monsters but as a genre of recognition. The moment when you see yourself in the darkness and realize the darkness is not external. It maybe is not a legend, but something rarer. It is true.